Sorry for the few-minute delay, but we thank you for being here. Welcome to the museum's November edition for Historic Presentation Night. My name is Becca Folsom. I'm the coordinator for this program. I am also the membership manager here. So if you have questions about your membership, feel free to come to me. I have a few announcements before we get started with this evening's program. As a friendly reminder, we are going to be closed on Thanksgiving, so we hope that you are spending time with your family instead of hanging out with us here. We will not be open on that day. Speaking of the Thanksgiving holiday, if you've been on our event calendar, we actually just added information about a Black Friday sale for that whole weekend. So members do get an additional 5% discount for the merchandise in the store. Sarah, our gift shop manager, has a variety of different discounts that will be available for different types of merchandise for that whole weekend. So I highly recommend putting that on your calendar. And from my understanding, we're also offering free museum admission as well, whether you're a member or not. We have two new events coming up in 2026. We have Rivets and Rosé, and we also have Wings and Whiskey. So information about those events are available on the website right now. Rivets and Rosé will be happening in March, and Wings and Whiskey will be in April. So take a look on that to learn more. We have Historic Presentation Night on the first Wednesday evening of each month, with the exception of January at 7:30. Members can reserve tickets for free. All event information is available on the website for more information about the events that we have, including Historic Presentation Night. We appreciate you spreading the word about these programs and encouraging people to attend. I do highly recommend reserving your spot online ahead of time if you are able, just so we have an idea of how many people we can expect. I'd like everyone to silence your phones if you have them on you, just for the presentation. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll be introducing Wendy in a moment. Originally from upstate New York, Wendy Zeeland became a lifelong Michigander after meeting her husband at the University of Michigan. She now serves as the Executive and Development Director of Bentix Academy, a nonprofit in Brighton, Michigan, where she leads efforts to foster mentorship through hands-on toolsmanship education. Wendy is deeply committed to youth empowerment and historical preservation. She draws inspiration from stories in the can-do spirit of recent generations, especially figures like Rosie the Riveter, the courageous women Air Force service pilots, the WASP, Eleanor Roosevelt, and pioneering aviators like Eddie Rickenbacker. Her passion of history was sparked by retracing the footsteps of the doughboy grandfathers and early American flyers across the battlefields of France. Today, she honors the legacy of America's heroes by sharing their stories, using the past to ignite purpose, resilience, and confidence in the next generation. Welcome, Wendy.
Need some can-do spirit right here.
I really want to thank you all. Every time I get into a room and I see a bunch of faces who are interested in history, I am wowed, because history should be our favorite subject. You know the old story, if you forget history, you tend to repeat it. Well, I'm going to share some history with you that truly I did not know about. I grew up thinking airplanes were pretty cool. I would watch them fly overhead, and I was pretty interested in the Wright brothers because my 7th grade teacher was a descendant of one of the two brothers' brothers. So I thought that was pretty cool. I didn't really get it until I did that doughboy walk across Europe. On the very field where my grandfather was very likely wounded, he saw, very likely, one of the gentlemen who was in the display tonight. And as I kept tracing and kept figuring out and kept talking to other people who very nearly did not exist because their grandparents too were on that field, that same field, and became wounded and nearly didn't survive. And as we all convened to say, very, very, very nice to see you here, I really became inspired by what the people who did not make it did on our behalf. And you're going to meet a pile of them tonight. So thank you so much. You could be sitting on your couch at home eating bonbons, but you are here thinking about history. And my biggest wish is that you are also inspired to track down the stories that are really pertinent to your families and to share them with the next generations. So, to be inspired, I will tell you how this happened to me because I too wonder why I'm not a quilter but instead an amateur historian. The quilting would be a little less expensive, that I can say. So I first want to mention Homer. This is my husband's grandfather. And he was in the trenches as a volunteer in World War I. He very likely saw our president's son, the only immediate family member of any of our presidents to be killed in battle, Quentin Roosevelt, go down. That must have inspired him in some way as he was fighting in the trenches to look up and see those guys flying around. He probably thought they're better off up there. In truth, they weren't. But he earned at least 2 silver stars, a citation, 2 Purple Hearts. So thank you, Homer. We believe, although we do not have proof, that he told his son, Gordon, about those stories. We don't know, but Gordon became inspired to go into the Air Force in World War II. He was a mechanic at Horsham St. Faith on the Liberators, very likely many of the Liberators that were built right here. And what he did there inspired him to build, took him 35 years, but to build a sop with camel working model was his goal in his garage. And you see some pictures there. He inspired the guy who I ended up marrying, Rob, to really, he was a car guy, but he didn't like to admit that. He wanted to be a plane guy. But we weren't making so many planes here, as you will find out, because Mr. Boeing ended up moving to Seattle, even though he was born in Detroit. So he was inspired to have a few inventions and so forth. And you can see in the bottom picture our 2 children and the Sopwith, which is currently in the air suit. So that's what inspired me. I married into this and inherited it, but once I started learning about it, I can't stop. All of the pictures that you see with the section devices are pictures that I took this year in different flights that I've taken. So let's start at the beginning. And for us tonight, that's 200,000 years ago. So raise your hand if you like math. Don't be embarrassed. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that in this little place here, there are a lot of people who like math. But you know, math gets a bad rap, and a lot of people think it's boring. Well, we're going to do some math. We're going to do it right now. And you can decide by the end of the presentation, I promise you, there's only one slide for those of you who did not raise your hand, that math can be interesting, but, all right, so here we go. 117 billion. That is the number of people who have been alive, who are defined by our current scientists as humans, from the beginning of humanity until today. And if you want to know where I got those stats, and there are a lot of them to look at to kind of cull it down, I will tell you afterwards. But this is the amazing part. 7% of all the people who have ever lived are alive today. And you can see that in that little chart because here you go, 200,000 BC. Oh, look, you can start to see some green. And look at where we are, right around 7 billion people alive today. So that's kind of interesting. You with me? Nobody's asleep. 3 billion. 3 billion. So 3 billion people have flown in an airplane. The airplane, there's a little controversy about this, but the airplane was invented in 1903. And look, we've been around since 200,000 BC. So That's a whole lot of flying that's been going on in the last just a little bit over 100 years. And 33% of them, of these people, of this 3 billion, they've already died. So when we got going, it took us a long time to figure this out, but we got going, and we got going pretty quickly. That also means that 2 billion people are alive today who have been flying. It is a little sticky here. Okay, so I find this fairly interesting too. 82% of Americans have flown. Raise your hand if you have not flown. 100% of this room, that's our math lesson. So 82% of Americans have flown, 52% of Chinese in big cities have flown. They account for a whole lot of that. And as it turns out, it's about the same number as here. 33% of the world's population has flown. Out of the 117 billion people who have lived, 2.6% have flown. That's wild. We've been around for a long time. So that's our math lesson. Now, I mean, anybody bored? You should be bored, right? Because math is boring, so I hear. I think history should be the most important lesson and the most fun lesson that you can take in school. And I think it comes down to telling the stories that are of interest. Going through the numbers, some of us data geeks think that that's pretty cool, but it's really the history that's interesting. So people, ever since the beginning, as long as people could write, they talked about things that happened up there. They talked in some cases about what actually happened, what they could see. They talked about the moon, the stars, they talked a lot about the birds. I was just recently in France you can't go into the caves anymore where they have the cave drawings, but they mocked one up in the Bordeaux Aquitaine Museum, and you can actually see where when it was really hard to draw, like you had to get charcoal and it was dark in there and all the rest of it, they still were trying to draw birds. People dreamed of flying. We all know about Daedalus and Icarus and the wings that melted. I have talked to people who have actually seen this statue in the Baghdad airport. I have not seen it. But for as long as people could write any recorded history, we've talked of flying. So along comes, and I find this interesting, I was reading a book that was talking from an Italian perspective, and they're pretty sure that they had a big hand in inventing flight because they had Leonardo da Vinci. And there is some reason to say that is probably accurate, because you can see the drawings that Leonardo made. He called it his ornithopter design. He really wanted to fly, but he had this little problem in that, Machiavelli was alive right then and all of that. And he had to keep, in order to keep getting commissions, he had to keep designing war machines. So he never got to actually build his ornithopter. But take a look at that design. While you're looking at it, remember that Leonardo da Vinci was not only left-handed, he actually wrote everything backwards, because he was left-handed, and he figured that anybody who was left-handed ought to write that way. I find that interesting. So there's another one, and I think here, actually, we're going over, I think that one was in France. So, fast forward, because not a whole lot happened until the 20th century. So actually, I guess in this case, you could say the 19th century. So Otto Lilienthal did something that Leonardo probably would have done if he had had the time, or a few others in between. He decided, and if you look at it, what does this look like? So maybe this is where the Italians get it from. Kind of looks like Leonardo's, doesn't it? He decided that he was going to do more than just dream about it. He was actually going to build some designs, and then he was going to take the very best data that he could take in any way he could take it. It wasn't so easy to measure things, and the people around him thought he was a little batty, maybe because he had grown some wings. So it was hard to get people to help him to take really good measurements. But he not only did the best he could, he became world famous for being the person who had the most data on how one might fly. He was very well respected. And you can see here the year is 1893. So you can fast forward from the Italian Renaissance all the way to 1893 before we make another vast leap. And that's if you consider the fact that Leonardo da Vinci did a lot and thought a lot, but he didn't actually build a lot because he had to think about the war machines. So who said that humans couldn't fly? Not Augustus Herring. And every time you see the little Michigan thing, you can say to yourself, oh, that has to do with us right here. I know that we're very well known for autos. Some of you may have heard of Henry Ford, etc., etc. But, in fact, where we are was seminal in many ways when it comes to flight. I was taught by my husband, who wasn't my husband then, but when I first moved to Michigan, I did not understand this football rivalry. He told me in very clear terms, he wasn't much of a football guy, but he told me in very clear terms that Ohio is beneath us. And he applied that to the Wright brothers, I'm sorry to say. If you are from Ohio, my apologies, I'm from New York. So, who said humans couldn't fly? Augustus Herring has a quite certain claim. There's a lot of proof that he actually was in a powered vehicle that lifted off. He was able to turn it a little bit, mostly because that's the way the wind blew, but it was powered. And where did he do that? On Silver Beach in St. Joseph, Michigan. And if you're a regular here, you've probably heard, I actually did not know about that until we had a presentation about it here. I was incredulous. So I went out, bought some books, you can see some of them up there, and this guy really did do this. And what's interesting is he started it in 1894, and he did this. A powered, you can see it here, there he is, there that is. Those are wings. He took off from the dunes in 1898. He's got everybody else beat. Even Lilienthal was not putting power onto his vehicle. So why isn't this guy famous? Well, you'll find out about that, and it has to do with, while he was quite brave, very daring, and actually quite smart, he was also a shyster, but we'll get to that. It goes to the point, you know, that telling wolf thing, if you don't tell the truth a whole lot, no one will ever believe you. So, I love, and I have dearly loved, and I was telling a friend about this earlier, I love studying Wilbur and Orville Wright. And it didn't start in 7th grade for me, but I really like reading about them. I've read a lot of books, I've watched everything I can watch, visited all the museums, always looking for more that I can learn. One of the things I love is he had his arm twisted in the early 1900s because the word was getting out that this unknown person with kind of an attitude, never smiles, probably understands a lot more about airplanes than a lot of other people. So Augustus Chanute asked him, he was from France and he was fairly famous and quite rich from some things he did with railroads, asked Wilbur to go to a big engineering conference and describe why he thought, this nobody guy, why he thought people could fly. And here's in a very short summary why he thought so. This is one of the things he did in his speech. He wasn't happy about the speech. He wasn't afraid to go up in the air and jump off things. He was very afraid of getting in front of people. I'm afraid to go up in the air and jump off things. But he took a piece of paper, and he had a lot of facts and figures, and he took a piece of paper and he dropped it. And he said in front of all these people, these engineers who really thought they were the best in the world, if you can describe why it went that way, you can fly. That's all we have to do. The trick to it was, it's not how we get up there. You can go up on something high, you can jump off, and guess what? You're flying, bad end, but you can do it. And people have been doing it. Not only that, they've been doing it under their own power. They've been taking balloons up. The whole balloon craze has been going on for quite a while. But he said, it's not how you get up there. Let's quit thinking about that. It's what you do when you're up there. And how did he know that? Because he spent the proverbial 10,000 hours when he should have been doing something else, daydreaming, watching birds. There was a good place down there in Dayton where there was some cliffs on the Miami River, and he liked to go there because the way that the wind currents went, these birds were out there doing that. Tiny little twitches in their feathers, in their bodies, and they could stay up there without flapping forever. Again, the flapping part, the energy part, whatever you have to do. He wasn't too concerned about that. And nobody else was thinking about that. Nobody else along the way ever thought about it in exactly those terms. I love it when we have some out-of-the-box thinkers. So the engineers looked at him and said, well, that's pretty interesting, and they all went back to their power tools. By the way, this was his greatest inspiration, and I managed to procure a little box of these. Not being so much of a power tool person myself, as much as I teach kids about them. If anybody wants to come up here and make one, I've got a pile of them if you want to try it. This was a toy that he and Orville had when they were kids. There's a rubber band, you wind it up, and the thing flies. Doesn't stay up there very long, but he remembered that. He remembered that toy. And with that, I will give all of you a caveat that when you talk to kids, or when you give them a toy, or when you're, whatever you say, whatever you do, whatever you expose them to, something may turn on. And that toy was cited by Orville and by Wilbur in later life as being the seminal moment when they became interested in something that at that point there was no one else in their surroundings who had any interest in it. Had a very interesting conversation with my dentist about a week ago. What does that have to do with this? So she is into dental history because it's Ann Arbor and you know. So she has studied a lot of famous people who had a problem with teeth. She didn't know about Wilbur. When Wilbur was in high school, he was very, very smart, very, very, very good at athletics. And he was out there on the hockey. In fact, he used some of the lessons he learned in hockey and skating in his later experiments. So he's out there on the ice playing hockey, and somebody who wasn't quite as good as he was took a swing at the puck, let go of the stick, and it ripped out most of his teeth. So for the rest of his life, in that year, he got accepted at Yale, which was really saying something. These were not wealthy people. This was your average middle class. Nobody else had that kind of education around him. He got accepted at Yale, and he chose not to go because he was so embarrassed about the fact that he had no teeth. So he did not go. His mother got sick at the same time, but he became something of a recluse who never smiled, never joked, except for around his own family. What did he do? He went out and he studied the birds. So we can thank that poor short who threw that hockey stick at him, because there is some good reason to think that the fact that Wilbur went silent on the rest of the world probably enabled him to think through a lot of problems that were in existence but not obvious to anybody else, including the people with the high-end educations. And I'm not knocking anybody who has a high-end education, but in this case, it freed his mind. So, September 19, 1901, that's when Wilbur makes his speech. Another reason why he was so afraid to make it. For those of you who can see this too, at the bottom of most of these slides is a quote that one of the people in the slide said. So Orville, his little brother, said, "Isn't it astonishing that all these secrets have been preserved for so many years just so we could discover them?" They were there. all the time. Sorry, having a trouble there. Okay. Is anybody in here from Connecticut? Oh, come on. Anybody in here from North Carolina? Yeah, North Carolina. No? Okay, good. We'll count them out. They say they're the home of flight. Not true. Not true. Okay, we already talked about Ohio. I'm personally partial to Michigan. However, the governor of Connecticut has stated on June 25th, 2013, Dan Malloy, governor, signed into state law, House Bill 6671, recognizing Gustav Whitehead as the first person to achieve powered flight. How many of you in here have heard of Gustav Whitehead? No. If you have, you probably came to one of these presentation nights. It's the first place I heard of him too. Oh wait, do you recognize this? My goodness, you can see why the Italians think they have a claim on this. So, if you remember, it was on September 19th, 1901, that Wilbur was saying, yeah, I actually think we can fly, this is all we have to do, doesn't that seem simple? This guy, in this thing, actually did it. There's a whole lot of proof that he did it. Now, he was able to control it, and it did have an engine that was actually bigger than the engine that 2 years later the Wrights were going to use. He was able to control it. He went a lot farther than the Wrights did it. He did it in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with a whole bunch of people watching. All of this is true. People took pictures of it. He did it a few times. On one of those times, because he was learning how to work the controls that he had just invented, he ran into a building. There are still descendants of the people who saw that happen. Why don't we think that he's the person who invented flight? I will leave that question for you to ponder. But this did actually happen. And it's in Scientific American from the day. It's in a bunch of journals. There is a lot of proof. I have some books up here. The person who didn't want this to be forgotten was actually a secretary in one of those buildings. Some years later, she started collecting all of this, and she couldn't even get the book published. We'll go on about how that happened. So there was another guy, Samuel Langley. Anybody here ever heard of Langley? Ooh, evil man in our big story. So Samuel Langley actually wasn't an evil man. I love astronomers. It was really my first scientific love. He was mostly an astronomer. He was not a do-it person, but he had a lot of money behind him because he was the head of the Smithsonian. So he hired other people to get out there because he said, ooh, hearing a whole lot about people flying, and I'm looking at these pictures and thinking, I bet we can do that. And I can probably do it here, and if I hire them, it'll be my name on it. That's pretty much how that went. So, he came up with something called an aerodrome, and those of you who are into Latin know that that was the wrong name for an aeroplane. That's what he decided to call it. And he sort of designed it, but he gave it to some young engineers, said, you design it, you make it fly, it's going to have my name on it, but I'll pay you pretty handsomely. So they did that. And then it's taken another couple of years here. We're in October of 1903. And you can see this beautiful aerodrome, as he called it. That's the back end, building in the back. That's not part of it, although it could have been for as well as it flew. That's the aerodrome right there. And his idea was to put it on a houseboat in the middle of the Potomac. He called all the press. He said, come on, you're going to see first man to fly. He also was aware that the Wright brothers were very close. So he knew he had to hurry. So he did it. It's up on the boat there, and the poor young pilot is there. The thing lifted about 3 feet, tipped over, fell into the Potomac, and nearly drowned the pilot. It did go up 3 feet, and that's important to remember. So, we go forward one more time. I do like this quote from him. An unsuccessful experiment is not a failure, but a means of instruction. Because he got pretty angry at those youngsters who were putting this together. He figured they must have done something wrong. He still claimed to be the first to fly because the aerodrome could have flown. I think Leonardo could have said that. So, who thinks they can run faster than an airplane? Pretty much all of us can. Perhaps not on all days, but certainly when we're kids. And as it turns out, the Wright brothers could too, because on December 17, 1903, when they put together, after doing so many experiments, first ever wind tunnel in this country, finding out and determining with barely high school educations that Lilienthal's charts were wrong. They determined not only that his charts were wrong, I don't have an example here, but most of you are familiar with what air wings look like. What Lilienthal said, what his figure said was that hump had to be in the middle. What they figured out, what Wilbur figured out, was that the hump has to be at the leading edge. Wow, I get chills when I think about that. I do actually like math, but I could not have figured that out. And it took them about 6 years to figure it out. But they went up against the greatest authority of the time and said, this doesn't work. It doesn't work. We can prove it. So, on that day, with, as you know, wings made of the thinnest and the very lightest possible wood, tiny little wood pieces, not even as big as a pencil in many cases. As I always say, with bed sheets and a bit of paint, they didn't even have the paint. They weren't really that sophisticated. What they had was all that counted. They had the right equation, they had the right shape. They had measured and had determined scientifically, and they were right. How long do those wings have to be? So, it took a couple of guys, you needed one on each end, and this is not actually the one that was up, this is from a couple years later. But I like the fact that the two of them are standing there trying to figure things out. It took two guys to hold the wings in the wind in Kitty Hawk. They needed wind, they knew how much lift. They had actually calculated it to be able to lift this plane up and to carry it forward. But they had to have guys who could run with it fast enough until it got up, because the slightest wind would warp the wings, it would touch the ground, and it was all over. So can you run faster than an airplane? You can, if you want to be the first person who's ever going to fly. And I do this sometimes with kids. You only have to go 120 feet in 12 seconds. That's about 6 miles an hour, but you only have to maintain that for 6 seconds. Or, I'm sorry, 12 seconds. So yes, you can run faster than that airplane. So what makes a plane fly? And we've already done our one math lesson, and this is really our one science lesson, and it's going to be really short. What the Wright brothers did, they figured out, they knew, and other people knew, that there are really just a few dimensions that you have to get a hold of. Bernoulli's principle is a big one. Bernoulli's principle is from this guy, Bernoulli, who's from the 1700s, who was watching streams and water, and he said, well, isn't it interesting the way that the water diverts? And isn't it interesting when you put things that float, the way the water diverts? And other things happened, and he too was a unique thinker. So he realized, oh, this is where pressure, this is what lift is. By the way, he never did that with air. He only ever did it with fluids. He did not realize that air is a fluid. That was another thing that came later. So, you need lift, you need thrust, you need weight, and when you're looking at this, it really is obvious, right? Doesn't that seem obvious? How did nobody know that? Well, nobody really did know that until these guys. I should have put on here, and I'm sorry I didn't, I'm going to change that, an actual Wright flyer. What the Wrights did over the course of 2 years is they went after the different directions one by one. And it's because of the hundreds and hundreds of experiments they did going down that hill in Kitty Hawk with a glider. What would happen with certain formulations is the plane or the glider would bounce, or it would have a hard time with the yaw. All of these things were happening. They went after them one by one. If they weren't going after the bouncing, essentially the roll, if they weren't going after that one, then they ignored whatever happened. They shut it down, they did not listen, they had Chanute and other people come by and say, you should do this, can't hear a thing. That's how they got it done. One by one, they fixed it. And I give them a ton of really credit and kudos. The other big thing that helped was they felt, and Orville said, and others said, this is actually just like riding a bicycle. You know what it's like when you ride a bicycle. You get on it, and you gotta get going, because if you're just going to sit there on it, you're gonna fall over. That's what made them realize. There was one experiment, actually, it was with that bouncing up and down. Orville said, oh, I've got an idea. And it was usually Wilbur with the bright ideas. In this case, it was Orville. Orville said, hey, I'm going to go get my bike. Wilbur's like, oh, I want to go to bed. No, I'm going to go get my bike. And they tied a wheel on it and kind of made it look a little bit like a wing. And then Orville was taken off. The way that he strapped it on the handlebars, he was able to tell how much of a yaw he was going to have. And that's what solved it. What they did was they put the front end on the tractor flyer. He solved it by doing that one night. And all of the neighbors in Dayton said, oh, here they go again. Oh my gosh. Wilbur, quit yelling at your brother. That's what it took. So, who really invented the airplane? Was it any of the above? This surprised me. I was entertaining a bunch of visitors from Brazil. I took them to Henry Ford, and we go into the model of the Wright flyer. I'm like, do you know who invented the airplane? And they said, yeah, Santos Dumont. I'm like, who is that? So let's go back to Augustus Herring's problem. Let's go back to Gustav Whitehead's problem. And frankly, the Wright brothers' problem. If you never tell anybody when it happens, if you don't have good marketing, if you are afraid for any reason to let your secret out, well, then people think you didn't do it. So this guy was flying around in 1906 in Paris, and he famously went around the Eiffel Tower. And everybody said, oh my gosh, we're going to adopt him as French. He invented the airplane. So it took a lot of years to get him over that, and in Brazil, they still think he invented the airplane, and I can tell you, you cannot dissuade them of that thought. So I put the Henry Ford up there because that's where I discovered that apparently my ideas were mistaken. Happily, I have done a little more research. It was bound to happen. When Wilbur and Orville started this, their father, they'd lost their mother, and their father wasn't pleased. It's like, boys, you gotta be careful. Lilienthal died in his glider. He had taken a few thousand trips, but something went wrong. There's a problem when you have gravity and nothing in between you and a hard surface. And it happened for the Wright brothers on the 17th of September, 1908. After they invented it, they never took a red cent. And a lot of people, when they figured out, oh, these guys know what they're doing, hey, how about we give them a few bucks and then we can get a piece of it? They turned down every penny. Every penny that went into their hobby was supported by their bicycle shop. But that had gotten old. So by this point, this thing was pretty expensive and they had to make some money. So who's going to buy an airplane? I mean, it looks kind of dangerous. One of the ways that they flew, what they actually figured out is you have to warp your wings just like those birds, only we don't have feathers. So the way they did it was by laying down in the plane with a hip cradle. It was kind of like doing a little bit of a ballet, and it was very hard to teach. There were levers, there were gears, there was a motor. You couldn't hear anything because the motor was right in your ear. And you had to move your hips the right way to make this thing work. It wasn't that intuitive, but the Wright brothers had been doing it all along. They were pretty good at it. So, Wilbur takes off for France. He becomes a massive celebrity. Never smiled. They said his eyes are the best thing about him. Wouldn't smile. But he's off trying to sell. He's meeting kings. He's just having a jolly good time. Orville was asked to stay home and sell to our own government. And one of the first people to ask for a ride was Teddy Roosevelt. And Orville looked at him and said, not happening, not happening. The whole flyer itself only weighed a little over 100 pounds. There was other equipment on it, but Teddy really would have rocked the boat. So he turned him down, or said, later, sir. So the guy who got to ride on this was the one and only person in our military at that time who knew anything about planes. And it's because he had been working with more hated enemies of the Wright brothers, Alexander Graham Bell and friends. Alexander Graham Bell had managed to get the patent away from the guy who helped to invent the telephone. You all know about that story. And Alexander Graham Bell was saying, you know, I've got some ideas about flight. I think I can make this work. And one of the people he chose to work with was a guy named Thomas Selfridge. Thomas Selfridge was in the Army. He was very bright. He had flown a couple of the contraptions that Graham Bell and others in their little aero club had come up with. So the Wright brothers didn't like him, but they really needed to sell airplanes, so they agreed to let him fly. Selfridge shows up, and he fortunately is not shaped like Teddy Roosevelt, but he's quite a bit taller. The Wright brothers weighed somewhere between 120 and 130 pounds. They weren't that tall, and they never ate because they were too busy doing this. So Selfridge shows up, and Orville says, whoa, that's a little heavier, and in fact, Selfridge weighed about 175. So Orville put different propellers on his airplane that morning. Bigger propellers, a little more lift, a little more propulsion. But the wings warped. And I didn't ask the museum here to bring in the example. You have in this museum a perfect example measured to specs of the Wright flyer. It's right out there over the spad. Go look at it. You'll see some guide wires. They're not holding it together. They might be on the example. But those were actually to warp the wings. When he warped the wings on this very, very windy day at Fort Myer with about 6,000 people watching, one of the propellers sheared off one of the guide wires, and of course he couldn't steer, and he crashed. And Thomas Selfridge died. And he was the first ever person in the history of all of those. At that point, it was probably about 90 billion people to die in an airplane accident. That happened in Fort Myers. As a sidelight, he had a class that he taught at West Point. Thomas Selfridge did, and in that class was a guy whose name was Byron Q. Jones. Byron Q. Jones became the first commander of the Selfridge Field. And about 25 years after that, he was actually the person whose name is on the patent for inventing the Jeep. So there's a little twist to history, unexpected, not related, but kind of cool. So this is Pleasant Lake, and this is out of a little Cessna I was flying in that was coming out of Mason, Michigan. The question is, what do you do with airplanes now that we have them? So there are a whole lot of people here who are trying to figure that out right from around where we are. The Wright brothers themselves. Orville was in the hospital for about 2.5 months. Wilbur initially said, Orville, what did you do wrong? But then he realized it wasn't anything that Orville could have done about it, and Wilbur was pretty lucky it wasn't he himself who had that happen. But it became very competitive, and the Wright brothers realized they had a problem. Especially Wilbur realized it when everybody thought Saint-Simon was the great inventor, that you have to actually show people what you want to do. And in fact, they couldn't sell any airplanes to the government because they wouldn't show them the latest model. They wanted them to pay for it first. So the government said, well, you have to show us. They said, no, you have to pay for it. And that went back and forth. And finally, Wilbur said, okay, we're gonna start exhibiting. We're gonna, go out and we're gonna do shows. So they hired some great pilots. They taught them how to do the hip thing. They sent them out there, and one of them was from right here in Ionia County. He was at the time, one of the most famous. It was Parmalee from Ionia County and another guy, Turpin, and they sent out postcards, which is how Turpin, there's the two of them, the Wright brothers are exhibiting here. They would have thousands and thousands of people, you can see the people down here, show up. And on this day, Turpin was asking his wife-to-be to become engaged. Very shortly after that, unfortunately, Parmalee, he had the very first commercial flight of an airplane. He was the very first pilot to drop a bomb. Interesting story. So everybody was asking, what do you do with an airplane? And somebody asked Wilbur, well, what are we supposed to do with these airplanes if we buy them? And he looked at them and he had a 3-letter answer. Anybody know what it is? War. He understood, and he wasn't happy about it, but he understood that there would be great value to being above, and Parmalee was the very first pilot to have somebody drop a bomb. How do you drop a bomb out of one of those? Well, you reach down like this and you look over and you throw it. So the aim wasn't good. He was also the pilot of the very first airplane to have somebody jump out in a parachute. So very interesting. So between 1909 and 1914, the aero expansion was immense. There were a lot of other people who got involved. What did Orville invent? Well, we already talked about it. The other thing he invented that you might be familiar with is the tail turning. That's Orville's invention. He was the first person to come up with that. But it's actually this guy, Glenn Curtis, who came up with the next best thing since sliced bread, which is this wing warping hip thing. It doesn't work so well for most of the people. It's really hard to teach. It's like teaching any of us how to do ballet if we haven't tried it in a while. So I selected this picture because you can see here Curtis with the ailerons. He said, I'm not doing that. That is not working for me. It's not very manly. So he put the ailerons on. He was the first person to do that. He also, when he heard about the Wright brothers, he was already famous for being the fastest man on earth. He's a very good machine builder. So he put a machine on a motorcycle or on a bike, and he became the fastest man on earth when he did that. Very, very good at machinery, very intuitive, kind of like Wilbur. Didn't have a lot of friends, didn't talk much, just liked to tinker. So unfortunately, he went to the Wright brothers and said, hey, I hear you got a thing there. I think I can really help you out because your engine, I can really make that a lot better. And Wilbur and Orville, and mostly Wilbur, looked at him and said, no way. We have our own thing. And they dismissed him. Well, he wasn't content, so he looked over the design. He said, I'm just building it on my own. And he did. And frankly, he built it quite a bit better. The Wright brothers didn't take kindly to that. The patent wars ensued. Soon after the Wright brothers had won their first version of the patent war, every single airplane created in this country, most of them in garages, owed the Wright brothers, as soon as it fly, $1,000, which was a lot of money back then. He was having a really hard time, the Wright brothers were having a really hard time collecting on that. But they took a look at him and said, this here is enemy number one, bar none. So the patent wars ensued, and it kind of went like this, up and down and back and forth, and it just wasn't good. I took that from a magazine because I just can't figure out a better way to describe what it was like. And by the way, let's go back to marketing for just a second. The very first officially witnessed flight in the United States was actually Curtis's, and I think I got the date wrong there, that was actually 1906. No, I'm sorry, it was 1908, but it was before the Selfridge accident. So Curtis didn't like to talk any more than Wilbur did, but he did understand whoever gets out there first wins it. To make his planes look different, he started putting canoes on them. He said, well, you know what? You have to have like a runner, and you have to have a catapult, and you have to do all this other stuff, because remember, we only care what it does once it's up there. Getting it up there is a bit more of a problem. Getting it down was even worse, because if you come down the wrong way, it hurts. So he said, better idea, we're gonna do this in water. He put canoes on the bottom, and he became the father of naval aviation. Those were really the days. There were other people, and here's another one from Michigan, Harriet Quimby. She was the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, first to fly the English Channel. She was also the second to die in an airplane crash, 1912. They were kind of dying off like flies after 1908. She was also one of the first to advertise. She got picked up by a place called Bin Fizz, which apparently was some sort of alcoholic grape cider, and everybody who ever tasted it said it tasted bad. However, she was born in Michigan, and you can actually go to Coldwater and you can see this sign. So, yet again, if a woman wants to fly, first of all, she must abandon her skirts. This is what she dressed like during the time she wasn't flying. Interesting to think. So, tennis, anyone? Here's another guy that I'm going to pick up. He probably flew in Michigan as part of a band of Europeans. The Europeans looked at the United States and said, yeah, they invented them. They have terrible planes there. We are so much more advanced. Roland Garros came over here just basically to see the place and to fly around with some other friends. So he also had a bunch of firsts. He was the first to fly across the Mediterranean. He was the first to use oxygen. He had to seduce a nurse to get the oxygen, but he was trying to make a world record for altitude, and it was dawning on him, it's a little thin up here, so he had a solution, and it worked. He got the oxygen, and he got the world record. So, pretty interesting. So, what are these good for? It is really interesting to look at it. The records were coming faster and faster and faster. And so we're looking at 1911, 1912, pretty much after 1910, the Wright brothers were out of it. They stopped really competing in terms of engineering. They went to war with patents, and Wilbur Wright died in 1912. So after he died, Orville kept on with it for a bit, and he finally sold the company in 1915. That's not all for Michigan, though. Anybody ever hear of Boeing? So, Mr. Boeing was born on 1101 Woodward Avenue in Detroit. His father made all of his money in the wood industry with all of our lush forests at the time, and Boeing probably would have ended up here, the company itself, except for the senior Boeing died, and his mother married a shyster who was after her money, and that forced young William, who did not get along with the stepfather, into boarding school in Europe. And when he came back, he still didn't want to come back to the father, so he thought he'd get as far away as he could, and Seattle seemed like a good place. So, unfortunately, Michigan lost a lot of the business for that, but we have a really strong claim. His parents are still buried here, as are his sisters. So it's an interesting thing. I think they're down in, I think they're in Elmwood. Technologically, what did we do? We really advanced. We advanced so fast, all of these things, all of this happened. And guys, this is only 10 years. Part 3. Remember that thing about war? What is this good for? 1914, So 11 years after the airplane is invented, we're at war. And Eddie Rickenbacker said, I can see that aerial warfare is actually scientific murder. So I'm going to go through these slides fast. Some of you have seen a couple of them before when we've talked about World War I. What is curious is the vast percentage of people who are from our area who participated. The Great War was all about how everything and all the ways that people had been fighting war hadn't really changed much since Caesar, Napoleon, the Civil War. It basically was man against man, and whoever had the bloodiest, strongest, you won the battle. The problem was we had all this different technology, including airplanes. When the Germans invaded France in World War I, there was one thing that prevented them from taking Paris, and that was a private pilot who flew above thinking, well, this is curious, and actually saw a hole in the German lines. Was able to scoot back, tell the French, I think we can stop them, and they did. They did that. They did take Paris in World War II, but they did not in World War I. Remember Garros? We were talking about him, you know, that little nurse seduction oxygen thing. Well, he also was considered the world's first fighter pilot, and he wasn't happy about it. He didn't want to go to war, but he decided that he had to support his country. What was happening wasn't good. So the big problem was, first, the only thing the airplanes did was go up and observe, right? Exactly what happened to prevent the Germans from taking Paris. But then people started getting the ideas, well, we'll shoot at the enemy and get rid of those guys. They won't see where our troops are and all of that. The problem with that is when you're bouncing around on this little kite with just this little motor and it's windy and this and that, it's hard to shoot. So the guns were mounted. When they were mounted, the problem with that was you had to shoot through the propeller. And if you didn't get your timing right, you would shoot your propeller off bad end. So it was actually Garros who came up with an idea on how to synchronize the gunshots with the propeller. And it was a fairly rudimentary idea. You can see the actual machine here, and you can see where sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but it worked a whole lot better than nothing at all. Unfortunately, when he went up there the first time, he had a bunch of victories, and the Germans saw him and they swarmed him and he was downed and they got his machine. So in comes Anthony Fokker. You've all heard of Fokker, you know, Red Baron, 3 wings, all of that, same guy. So he took it apart, and he was a very good engineer. He made it better, and the Germans really had it all over the Allies for quite a while. Roland lives on today. This was not too long ago where he was buried. There are monuments to him all over France. There are names, street names. They really claim him everywhere you go because he became famous for being a tennis player. He wasn't actually that much into tennis, but he was really good looking, and being a pilot made him very famous and dashing. So he played tennis now and again, and if you're into Wimbledon, they actually named the field where they play tennis at Wimbledon Roland Garros. Aces. What's an ace? An ace is anybody who gets 5 kills or 5 victories, however you want to put it. This was actually really hard to do. Again, these guys, at this point, they had a fair amount of practice. You know, they'd been up in planes. Most of them, if not all of them, were quite wealthy because to buy the plane, on average, it cost about $200,000 for a plane at that time. To build it, everything was by hand, and a lot of it was machined, and no two were alike. So you had to be rich. So they were rich, and they were a little debonair, and they came up with this thing that if you get 5, you're an ace. So the British had aces, but they never liked to tell anybody. They had some really good aces, and this guy was probably the best of them. He had 61 victories. What's interesting is how quickly they aged. I was just reading a book where yet another one of the aces was talking about how nobody stayed in the RAF essentially over 3 years. even if you survived because your nerves were shot. And you can really see the difference with this guy. Canadian aces, and this is where our family comes in. This is Billy Barker. He was the ace of aces for the Canadians, and that is his Sopwith, and it is that plane that our father-in-law put together with the exact specifications. So he got the Victoria Cross, and he survived the war, which all of them survived if they went down, and they had to go into rehabilitation for a while, long enough to outlast the war. That's what happened to him. But unfortunately, like many of them, he became a severe alcoholic, and in 1931, he went up in a plane for an exhibition, and he was not equipped to do so, and unfortunately, he died. German aces, here are the famous ones. Von Richthofen, Frank, look at the number of victories they have. And who's the very best of them all? For the Americans, Eddie Rickenbacker, 26. But these guys have been in the war. There was a thing about the German aviators. When you went in, you were in. And you only got out one of three ways. Number one, you won the war. Or I guess you lost the war. Number two, you were wounded so badly that you could not work the controls. And some of them lived through it that way. And number three, the most common by far, you died. So we didn't do it that way. We gave our people a little bit more grounds. And interestingly enough, Rickenbacker, you were only allowed to go in if you were under 25. He went in at 27 and didn't really fly until 28. But he pulled some strings because he was a famous race car driver. Who was the Red Baron? Okay, raise your hand if you know who Snoopy is. Please tell me you know who Snoopy is. I asked this to a lot of kids. They do not know who Snoopy is. So I find that amazing, but I will tell you, about 15 years ago, a lot of people didn't know who Rosie the Riveter is either. So things can be changed. So the Red Baron was Von Richthofen, who we just saw. When Charles Schulz drew Snoopy, he drew Snoopy on that doghouse to be a Sopwith. It wasn't just the Sopwith. The Newports, which the French had rotary engines. What happened with these very light planes is the engine would go around, and the propeller and everything else wanted to go around it. The engine wanted to stay still. So it was very difficult for the pilot to drive. The Brits lost 1/3 of their pilots in training. That's bad. We were much better. We lost about 1/4 of ours in training. We lost almost 5,000 out of 20,000 men. We only lost a little under 300 in combat, but it was tough. So when you see that doghouse going around like this, the reason is, if you could figure out how to work this thing and how to get out of the spin, and the Brits themselves, here's the training manual. This is all you got. This is the United States. We had a better one. This is the training manual. Can you see that? That's it. You sat in a chair, they gave you a broomstick, and they said, here, go ahead. Or they took some unworking airplanes, chopped off the wings down to little stubs, called them penguins, and said, try that out in the field. Obviously, didn't work so well. Successful aces, marksmanship, master mechanics, etc., etc. There was really one thing that you needed to be a successful ace: lucky. You had to have all the other stuff, but that wasn't it. The Lafayette Escadrille, we didn't go into the war until it had already been going for 3 years. So a bunch of our rich kids said, I'm all vive la France, let's go. So they went over, and they pretty much had to fund their own way. And they formed the Lafayette Escadrille. Many of them had ties to France for one reason or another, perhaps one of their parents or their history or whatever it was. We owe these guys a ton of things. Without them, our guys here were learning how to fly things that were so far behind the times. We got over there. Mostly we were flying rejects from the French, or in some occasions the English. That's what we had, but they were a lot faster. The escadrille guys who did this of their own free will, and actually, they were in danger of getting thrown out of the United States citizenry or starting a war between Germany and the United States because they were supposed to be non-combatants. So they did some trickery with the paperwork. Very famous of them all is Rolf, a very dear friend who really taught Eddie Rickenbacker how to fly. And at Selfridge, he was part of the 94th Aero Squadron. His name is actually up on the wall. Lufberry and Rickenbacker, they spent a lot of time drinking. You can probably imagine why. They also had 2 lion cubs as their pets, who grew into full-fledged lions. So they were trying to figure out what to put on the side of their airplane. And you go out here, you can see the hat in the ring because they were throwing their hat in the ring once the United States entered the war. And I've had a bunch of these pins made up, and I'm going to pass them around. And if you would like one, please take one. This will be your reminder that our history was to help change that stalemate. So they're up here, and when we get a little further in, I'll ask some of my friends up here to pass them out to you. But this is a very famous symbol. After the war, Rickenbacker started his own car company, and he actually was pretty innovative. It went very well until it didn't because Henry and crew didn't want the competition. You know how that goes. So for a while, the 94th Aero Squadron couldn't use this, but eventually they went back to it. So, out of the under 300 escadrilles, 78 of them died. So again, about a third of them. These are all rich kids. So their rich parents said, we're going to build a big monument in Paris. This thing is about the size of the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées, and it's in the center of Paris, too. Interestingly, how many of you have ever been to Paris, and did you know this existed? Most people don't, because the French don't like anything else to be bigger than theirs. So it's surrounded completely by trees, and it's extremely hard to find, but it is quite beautiful. And now it's part of our American battlefield. And in there's a mausoleum, and you can see Lufberry, that's actually where he's buried, and many other famous people. And Michigan, out of the escadrille, has these 6 people who were part of the escadrille. Not all of them. This one, you will recognize him, Phelps Collins base, so you'll recognize him. We're going to talk just a minute about Zinn. And the histories of these, I mean, these are really stories worth reading. Collins, you recognize because he was the very first member of the U.S. Air Service to die in a combat mission. So, how many of you know who he is? I mean, Collins used to be a famous name, but it's another one of those names that's gone by the wayside. So the Alpena Combat Readiness Training Center was formally named for him. But this is the one who I really love. Fred Zinn was in the escadrille, and then he got wounded, which is how he survived it. When he got wounded, there was a lot of, when you're up in the air, Germans against us, whoever kills the other one, you know, that's what you're doing. But if you fell to the ground, that's all gone. Everybody's like, yeah, very interesting. Did you see that technique? Let's get together. We'll have a few. Yeah, I know the POW police are going to come pick you up, but in the meantime, we're all good. That happened to Zinn. And he said, when people died over there, the other side would swoop over and maybe drop a wreath or something like that. There was a tacit agreement that when we're really up there, we kill each other. Because that's what our government says. When we go down, no man can be left behind. Let's honor the people who have died. Zinn witnessed that. And he witnessed it so much that when Quentin Roosevelt went down, he went after it to make sure that Quentin, he wrote to Quentin's mother and father and said, I'll get the body. And he did. So what he ended up doing, he lived through it, graduated from the University of Michigan, and went on a crusade to have that become how the United States treats all of its soldiers. this was really the first major war where we were leaving a lot of people behind. And he was very instrumental in making sure that we brought them back. There's Quentin, and he is actually buried in Normandy, right next to his brother who died in World War II. And it's one of the few that they would let be in the cemetery in Normandy who didn't die in World War II. So one of the oddities was there wasn't an Air Force. It was, you had to go into the Signal Corps. Signal because your job was to observe what was happening, so that meant signaling or telling people what to do. So the Signal Corps was part of the cavalry, so all of these guys getting out of these paper airplanes that were kind of built on pencil spruce had to actually wear spurs. And it was by law they had to do that. And eventually they had to have another act to say, okay, well, if you're in the air service part, you don't have to wear spurs. So I find that kind of interesting. The aviation gap was so severe, our best plane was a Curtiss plane. The engine part was good. In fact, the Brits said the only thing that the Yanks actually had to offer when it came to aviation was the Liberty engine. We were pretty good at the engine part. We couldn't build any airplanes. When we went into the war, who invented the airplane? Let's say the Wright brothers. Wright brothers invented the airplane just 14 years earlier. When we got there, we could send no planes at all. Our planes, our best planes that we bragged about so much, they're on this stamp. The stamp is upside down because so few people had seen a plane. When the Europeans went in the war, they stopped sending people. We couldn't figure out what do you do with planes. We weren't making very many of them. So that's the Curtiss Jenny, and it's actually upside down. The guy who made those stamps didn't know any better. So if you ever see one, truly do not throw it away. One of them is sold for $2 million. It's the single most valuable stamp ever produced in this country. There's the Curtiss. And this is a working Curtiss that was at the Selfridge Air Show 3 years ago, I think now. And I'd actually talked to this guy about going for a ride on it, and then the next year he crashed it. And he walked away from it, but his wife said, you don't get to fly it again. So it's now at Selfridge, and it's being restored. And right here, it's actually upside down, just like in the picture. So you can go and see it now. Selfridge, the museum is closed until April, but you can go in April and you can take a look at it being restored. 60 miles an hour. So if you've ever driven a Model T and then you want to get into a Formula One race car, you can see why the life expectancy of our pilots was under 6 weeks. Their percent chance of surviving the war when they went in was 0. And they knew it. And they fought to get those jobs because the trenches were so horrible. But the trenches were actually safer than the air. So it didn't work out very well. However, we only had 3 airfields when we went into that war that could operate to train people, and they were training them with those Jennies at 60 miles an hour, and the Penguins, and the broomsticks, and it wasn't going very well. But Selfridge, for example, opened up in 1917. It's the second oldest continually operating airfield in this country. Only Langley again, got his name on something, only Langley is older. So there's the SPAD, and I put this here so you can see this was the state-of-the-art French flyer, and those are a couple of bombs, and they didn't do this much with pursuits, but the concept is similar. Happily, by the time we got in, they figured out bombing wasn't working so well, but you basically had to dig down somewhere below your feet with all the operations, pull the bomb out, dip the plane, and they're gravity operated, right? So, you might stall, don't spend too long, look down, figure out, are they German? Are they American? Who's down there? Oh, okay, yeah, I think I should drop the bomb now. By that point, you're still going about 100 miles an hour. So you might have to circle back, and they are shooting at you. So yeah, that's what our guys were up against. So 20,000 pilots trained. 5,000 died in training. If you just got a new job and they told you that, well, you have about a 25% chance of living, or 75% chance of living, I don't know how it would go. But yeah, so Pershing said, he was our Eisenhower of World War I, and he said, our job is not to fight the way that these guys have been fighting. It's not going so well. And he almost got court-martialed for saying it, because there's a lot of pressure on President Wilson to just give our men over. But he said, we're going to figure out a way to break that stalemate. And the big break was the Meuse-Argonne. And here's an example of somebody who, this guy actually knew Louis Chevrolet. He was born in Detroit. He knew Edsel Ford, was a good friend of his. He was an Ivy League student. And he said before the war that he wasn't getting girls in Cornell, essentially. He said, I know, I'm going to become a pilot. It's pretty glamorous. And he did. Good-looking guy. He goes in, gets his pilot's license in the Army Signal Corps before the war, and he loves it. And we have here one of 18 copies, courtesy of Selfridge, of all of his letters home, where he says, Dad, I'm in the Army Signal Corps here, and they don't feed us because they forget about us. Can you send money? Dad, they just finally gave us uniforms months later, and they're really scratchy. Can I take the guys to the haberdashery? Dad, they are making us get up at 3 in the morning to walk to the field, because, we don't have any cars. Can you just send a car? So his dad is helping him out with all of this. Unfortunately, he made it the standard amount of time. We got into the war. His father was unable to talk as much money as he had to talk the government into not sending his son directly. He had to go, and he made it the standard amount. I think he went up 4 times before he was shot down. So this is what it looked like from above. These are actual lines. I took this picture 2 years ago in the spring, and this is the Hindenburg Line. It goes all the way from the Baltic down to Switzerland. You can see what it's like today. There is still so much lead there that when stuff starts to grow, where the actual line is, it's white. You can't eat it. So that's what they were looking at. Poor William didn't make it, but the French were so grateful that they built this big monument in the city. Interestingly enough, the back end of it is actually a machine or a garages, but William's body was reinterred here back in Michigan, and that's his stone down in Detroit. They named the street after him. So they were very grateful. Training ramped up at Selfridge Field. Selfridge is an interesting place. They say, and I'm trying to track this down, that there were over, I think, 145 generals were trained there. They didn't really keep the records very well. I can't tell you all of them, but Curtis LeMay was one. He said about Selfridge, a guy who never talked much, if you know who he was, big guy in World War II, big guy overall. He said about Selfridge, it's cold there. And hence, there are a whole lot of air bases in the south, but not very many in the north. So balloon busting was a big deal. It was actually more dangerous because you had to get low to the ground, and all the people on the ground were shooting at you. So we had a guy who Rickenbacker thought was the cat's meow, best pilot he ever saw, absolutely fearless. He got up, he said his superiors didn't like him much. He didn't like to follow directions too often. He got up and said, these guys are mocking me. They don't think I'm getting the victories I know I'm getting. And that's because he's getting so many they couldn't really figure them out or count them. So he said, there's a balloon, I'm going to get that one at this time, and then this one, and then this one, and he went out and he did that. And everybody saw the balloons go down, and they couldn't believe it. He did it at the time, on the hour, that he said he was going to do it. Unfortunately, he was killed right after that. But it was extremely difficult. It was the only time you really had to worry about flak At the time, flak was called Archie, which was the name for the guy in Britain who was with your girlfriend. Something unwanted that you wanted to get rid of. Nobody ever really got killed from flak unless you were going in for a balloon. Balloons were very dangerous. Plus, he hit the balloon, they were very flammable, they would go up. It was a real problem. But Frank Luke did it. Now we have Luke Air Force Base. He got the Medal of Honor, and that's his grave. And the Mews are gone. In fact, we had a number of Medal of Honor aviators. One of them, Bleckley, if you've ever heard of Cher-Ami and the Lost Battalion, it was actually Bleckley. Cher-Ami is the pigeon because that was the best mode of communication. Cher-Ami was the pigeon who was informing and made it through all the enemy lines, because if you were a pigeon, they were close enough to the ground to be shot down. Cher-Ami made it, and she is the only pigeon in the Smithsonian. So Bleckley actually was the observer, and being an observer in an airplane was awful because you had no control over everything. You just had to wait to go down, and that's actually what happened to him. And in Michigan, we have an aviator who also received the Medal of Honor, and he's buried in St. Ignace. Hamilton Coolidge is a favorite of mine. I was talking to a historian, an archaeological historian who was here. Where did you go, Dave? There he is. There's Dave. This is actual wreckage from his plane. He was the third great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson, and also the nephew of Calvin Coolidge, and he is the single only American who was shot down by flak. And the sad, sad part of this is the war was almost over. It was only a little more than 2 weeks, and he was shot down. My grandfather probably saw him go down. This is the farm where my grandfather was. This is the Air River, and he went right down on the bank. And he was Eddie Rickenbacker's boss at the time. Eddie Rickenbacker really went on a wild rampage after this happened because he was very well liked. Hamilton Coolidge was, and that's how Eddie Rickenbacker got to be ace of aces. But it is sobering, and the people in this village, they don't forget him. So this is the field where my grandfather stood, and I have a bunch of artifacts from this field. Just behind this is sunflowers and corn. Also, the Germans, they had parachutes. They always have better equipment, both wars. True to form. So Rickenbacker's up there. He shoots a couple down. He's looking at it going, what is that mushroom? You gotta be kidding me. And Rickenbacker, after the war, went to war with our government. You mean you had parachutes and you did not give them to us? The Brits said if they gave parachutes to their guys, they just jump out and let the planes go, and those things are expensive. As it turns out, it doesn't really work that way. They fight harder because they know they might survive. They had these, and as you saw, because of Parmalee, we had them for a long time. But our guys didn't get to have them, and that's sad. So again, and actually, I've got 2 batches here. If you would like to, in honor, I'll hand these to you, and if anybody else wants to pass them out, I have a bag here. Please take a pin in honor of Armistice Day and of these extremely brave, if you will pass these out on the other side, these extremely, extremely brave people who were totally crazy, but without them, we would not be able to do what we do today in the air. Eddie Rickenbacker and my husband's father were friends, and we didn't know that. They weren't close friends, but I have up here a book, one of the original copies of Eddie's autobiography, with a very nice personalized note signed to Gordo, my father-in-law. So I think the world of this guy. So not only is he the aces, World War II, FDR says to Rickenbacker, MacArthur, he's crazy. I need some help. I need you to get over there to the Pacific, talk to that guy, and tell him to listen to my directions. Rickenbacker's like rolling his eyes, but he's like, okay. He gets in a plane, he's not piloting it, and the guys who are piloting it are really worried that Eddie Rickenbacker is in the back. Unfortunately, the plane goes down in the ocean, they get in a life raft, they lose some guys, but there's still some guys left. They're in a life raft. Eddie Rickenbacker saves them by catching a seagull with his hands. True story, they're in this raft something like 3 weeks. Eventually they were rescued. Some of them did die, but Eddie survived. I mean, he also was afraid of heights, and that's a good read too. So, what a legacy. And again, he came back, he was stationed for a short period of time here at Selfridge because the 94th came back to Selfridge. Here's some more Michigan aces. It's extraordinary. And then the war is over. I would say that that's the end of the story, but you know we have other things happen. In summary, here we are. We can fly 10 feet off the ground in 1903. By 1938, we're up in miles. So how many war machines does it take to get to everyday wings? Well, after the war, in both World War I and World War II, they didn't know what to do with these planes. So they were selling them for cheap, and then somebody came up with a bright idea. You know it's going to be post office, because wouldn't you like to have your mail sooner? And that became these companies. Look what they became. United, TWA. So from letters to life's lifted. Eventually, there's Charles Lindbergh. He also was born in Detroit, just in case anybody wasn't aware of that. He didn't grow up here, but he was born here, and he trained at Selfridge. And he also didn't like it. So, but he trained well. Look what he did. Hot passengers, cargo, mapping, technology. These are all the airlines that were started right out of the war or shortly after. United, American, Delta. Delta actually is the youngest, 1925. The very first one was 1919, KLM. Who gets to fly? Women, come on. We are only 4% of the pilots globally. African Americans are only about 4% in the United States. And it's only 2.5% Latino. So it's still not exactly widespread. You can see what the map is. Flight safety. What is the safest mode of transportation? You bet. You bet. Look at the stats. So in conclusion, in my opinion, the machines are really important. You can't do this without a good machine. But it's the story of the people. And these people really put everything into it. They put their lives into it. This is a Kitty Hawk, and it's the memorial to Wilbur and Orville Wright. And here's the thing, just to conclude about those patent wars. Where did the Wright flyer go? How many of you have seen it in the Smithsonian? Yeah, I actually took that picture in the Smithsonian. But did you know that on his deathbed, Wilbur made Orville, I mean, you know, didn't exactly go this way, but essentially, don't let that flyer get into Langley's hands. Langley was also dead by that time. But he didn't want the Smithsonian to get it. So, the Smithsonian decided to make a big memorial to Langley saying he actually invented the first manned flight, because it did go up 3 feet. And if it had gone a little higher, well, you know, it could have flown, and that's all you have to prove. It could have flown. So Curtiss was so involved with patents that he said, oh, I have an idea. And I love Curtiss. Curtiss was as brilliant as Wilbur. But I actually really feel bad that he did this. He went and he got the Langley original machine and he doctored it so it would actually fly. Because he knew how to make things fly by that point, so that he could get out of the patent wars. And for that reason, Orville had an idea. He said, never. He sent the flyer to England. It actually went through World War II in England, buried underground. So, the real hero here of the whole story who saved the legacy and understood marketing was this Brit, aviation hero, Griffith Brewer. Ever hear of him? You can thank him whenever we say the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Thank him. He should get the billing because he actually was there when Curtis was doctoring the airplane, and he took some pictures and didn't realize what they were. So eventually he got in contact with Orville and he said, hey, I have these pictures of Curtis tinkering with, the aerodrome. Would you like them? So Curtis was not Curtis, but Orville. Orville was very much understood how to do the lawsuit thing, goes to court, and finally, in 1948, we got the flyer back. And today, even in France, even in Germany, we are recognized as the inventor of the airplane. So, with that, we're not going to watch this. Thank you. With that, I would like to thank you all. I really invite you to tell your stories. If we don't preserve the past, if we don't inspire the future, we just repeat it. And some of this we don't want to do again. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney, for the incredible presentation. We appreciate you coming out this evening to speak, and you all for coming to the museum this evening to hear her speak. December's program will feature Wright Scholar and Master Historic Presenter Kirk Haas. He will be back again.
Yes, definitely.
So he was here earlier this year. He's incredible, and he'll be speaking about a very similar topic, but 50 years before the Wright brothers. So I highly recommend coming to check that out. We'd love to see you. As always, these tickets will be on sale on the website starting technically tonight at midnight. But we'd love for you to be here, and that will be happening on December 3rd at 7:30 right here in this room. One last thing, don't forget about the donation boxes. We can't do these programs and the other things we do here at the museum without the support from you all. Have a safe drive home, and we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.